Hi everyone and welcome. Today we're looking at how fast-growing companies plant the seeds of their future challenges when doing exactly what they need to do to successfully navigate hypergrowth. More specifically, we will talk about 3 ways that hypergrowth inevitably cripples a company. For each of them, we will describe what the problem is and where it's coming from, how to detect it, and what we can do about it. Since there is a lot to talk about here, we will cover this topic in 3 videos. This is part 1, and I'll put the link to part 2 and 3 in the description below. My name is Antoine, and on this channel, we connect the dots between strategy, organizational design, leadership practices, and culture to figure out how we can build better companies. So consider subscribing if you're interested. In 2009, a small, unknown indie game developer quietly launched a game for a niche audience of hardcore competitive PC gamers. The success of the game took everyone by surprise, including the developer. The company is Riot Games, and the game is League of Legends. Riot Games broke all the codes. They defied all expectations and shook the video game industry to its core. Within a few years, League of Legends became a global phenomenon. It was the most played PC game in the world, and eventually Riot grew to a 3,000 people company with offices all over the world, from LA to Istanbul, Seoul, Dublin, and more. Whatever way you look at it, Riot is an incredibly successful company. And like every other company before them who had a similar trajectory, they eventually reached a critical milestone, the need to gracefully navigate their way out of hypergrowth. The moment a company is no longer carried forward by its own momentum, everything changes. We wake up to a different reality and we may realize that what got us here won't necessarily get us there. Some of the mental models, beliefs, and ways of working that seem to work so well up until now don't necessarily work anymore, or even worse, they may now holding us back. We have emerged from hypergrowth victorious, but also crippled. And when I say crippled, I don't mean doomed. It's not the beginning of the end. I mean in the most literal sense of not being able to function properly and move optimally due to an injury, an illness, or a malfunction. That also means that it's a condition that we can recover from as long as we are aware of the problems and willing to tackle them. While the topic of how companies change and transform as they go through various phases of the life cycle has been widely covered over the years, there are 3 specific problems that are never really talked about in the case of fast-growing companies. 3 problems that have, in my experience, a profound impact on the ability of the company to gracefully transition out of hypergrowth and sustain their success over time. The first problem is the difficulty to move beyond a getting shit done culture. The second problem is the fact that our decision-making engine is almost inevitably biased. And the third problem is the likely growing disconnect between who we say we are and how we actually work. Alright, let's get into the first problem, moving beyond the getting shit done culture. One of the defining characteristics of hypergrowth is that there are way more problems to solve and opportunity to go after than there is hours in a day and people in the organization to tackle them. And obviously that's a great problem to have. It means that more and more people want our products. And when money is not a problem, a lot of it comes down to execution. During hypergrowth, there is relatively little uncertainty around what needs to be done. But since almost everything is new to the organization, there is a lot of uncertainty around how to do it. People at Riot often refer to the few years after launch as a time when we're building the plane while flying. During hypergrowth, speed is of the essence. Effectiveness trumps efficiency, and one of the keys to successfully surf that wave is to be reactive, to make quick decisions, and to execute fast. To put it simply, we have to develop a strong culture of getting shit done. We need proactive, action-oriented problem solvers. People who will pick up a problem, run with it, and figure out how to solve it as they're running. So what's the problem with that? Well, since during hypergrowth, there is no shortage of obvious problems to solve or opportunities to go after, the next most important things to do are fairly obvious. And as a result, prioritization and alignment are relatively straightforward. Almost every problem is important and impactful. Here's the catch though. When growth starts to slow down, that most fires are under control, and that the environment is much more stable, the next most important things to do are no longer that obvious. While we now know how to climb mountains, it's no longer necessarily obvious what mountains we should climb. Prioritization is no longer as straightforward, and alignment can be fairly painful to achieve. The uncertainty has shifted from how to what and why. And we need to ask different types of questions. For example, what is going to move the needle from now on? And how do we measure our success? Or what is our next big challenge? At that point, we need to shift gears. Leaders and teams need to stretch much more often a different kind of muscle, deliberate strategic thinking. And since strategic thinking is a skill, like any other skill, it requires constant practice to grow and stay in top shape. However, right out of hypergrowth, that skill is usually underdeveloped. Again, just to be clear, that challenge is inevitable. A company is unlikely to survive hypergrowth unless it's committed to putting effectiveness before efficiency, to focus on the how questions much more so than the what and the why questions. At that point, having underdeveloped strategic thinking capability is not a mistake. The mistake would be to miss the signals that indicate that a getting shit done culture is no longer enough, and it's time to augment it by injecting a core of deliberate strategic thinking to tackle much more reliably the what and the why questions. So, what are the signals that indicate that it's time to shift gears? Well, the first one is obviously that growth is decelerating. The first time that reality hits will usually throw waves of panic through an organization that has known nothing but continuous growth, even though we know that nothing grows indefinitely. On top of that, even though growth slows down and revenues flatten, it looks like costs still keep growing. That's usually a very good indicator that a strong bias toward action without clear strategic intent can lead to a lot of activity and busyness without necessarily a lot of impact and value creation for customers. The second signal is that we are running out of obvious problems to solve. And I'm talking here about the kind of problems that have an obvious positive impact on customers and the bottom line. As we said earlier, during hypergrowth, those are in large supply. For example, we can launch in a new market, remove an obvious barriers to adoption, or upgrade our infrastructure. But now, nobody can say really anymore with absolute confidence what will be the next big needle mover. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. It's just that they're no longer obvious, and they will often emerge from a series of deliberately crafted experiments. The third signal is that various growth initiatives are now popping up around the company. Up until now, growth was a given, and it was putting the organization under tremendous pressure. But now, growth is something that needs to be chased. And a new language starts to emerge. We start talking about LTV and retention and acquisition funnel. We start monitoring churn, and we try to understand better why customers start using our products and why they stop. Finally, there are a number of organizational symptoms that can be felt in the day-to-day. For example, number one, more and more projects and initiatives get started only to be dropped a few weeks or months later because an influential stakeholder has a different opinion on priorities. Two is that decision making slows down. Every decision now requires alignment between more and more stakeholders, and it feels like we're spending more time making presentations to management rather than solving real problems for customers. Number three is that layers of monitoring and control are being put in place to mitigate the fear that teams will make bad decisions, work on the wrong stuff, and waste company money. It feels like trust is no longer commonplace. And finally, number four, the company is becoming more self-absorbed. A lot of projects are about the company instead of the customer. Obviously, each one of the symptoms, when looked at individually, could be the expression of many other types of underlying root causes. But when they show up together as a pattern throughout large parts of the company, they are a pretty good indicator that there is a lack of strategic clarity and that the getting shit done culture has reached its limits. So, what can we do about it? Number one, invest in strategic thinking training for everyone, not just your leaders or team leads, everyone. That includes your accountants, customer service agents, and visual designers. What you want is to create a shared language and a way of thinking that becomes natural for everyone in the company. We should aim to give everybody the tools to make strategic decisions all the time. Number two, hire a few strategic thinking athletes, whether it's full-timers or consultants, to help you with two specific outcomes. The first one is to provide ongoing coaching bandwidth for people in the organization, beyond the formal training program. The second outcome they will help you with is that they will work with you on type 1 decisions. Jeff Bezos famously wrote in one of his letters to shareholders what he calls type 1 and type 2 decisions. The main point about type 1 versus type 2 decisions is that you shouldn't treat all decisions in the same way. A type 1 decision is a big strategic decision that is hard to turn back from. A type 2 decision, on the other hand, is like a regular two-way door. You can go through pretty easily, and if it turns out that it was a bad decision, the consequences aren't disastrous. Number 3, clarify accountability and simplify your decision-making process. When a team needs the buy-in, read approval from multiple sponsors or leaders before committing to a plan of action, you probably haven't achieved clear accountability. While a team can seek guidance and advice from many people around the company, they shouldn't have to get approval from many different stakeholders. Alignment can be difficult to achieve and, more importantly, to maintain over time. Number 4, actively promote a culture of experimentation where teams are able to self-determine when to move forward and when to pivot. Embed the expectations of experimentation in how you measure performance of teams. Your team performance assessment process needs to take into account and support deliberate experimentation, learning, and thoughtful risk-taking in order to design an environment where those behaviors will naturally flourish. And number 5, set clear expectations and define team identities based on impact, not activities. Each team should have absolute clarity on who their customers are and what is the expected impact they're supposed to have on them. How they deliver the impacts, meaning the activities, is for them to figure out. Impact should be front and center, not activities. Okay, that was a lot to cover, and it looks like the sun is here with us now. This was part 1, where we talked about how companies need to outgrow the culture that made it even possible for them to successfully navigate the hypergrowth phase. In part 2 and 3, we will talk about the other 2 problems related to hypergrowth. The fact that our decision-making engine is almost inevitably biased, and the growing disconnect between who we say we are and how we actually work from a culture perspective. So stay tuned for the next videos. If you find this video valuable, there are a few ways you can support my work. You can give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, or you can share it also on your network and social media. Finally, if you'd like to share some feedback, some observations or comments, feel free to leave a comment in the section below, or reach out directly to me on LinkedIn. Thanks for watching, and until next time.